The esophagus is just a long, hollow, muscular tube that collapses when not in use and looks like this one over here. So I'm going to put it number 2, collapse not in use. And it's covered with serosa below the diaphragm, which is just a little bit, but above the diaphragm, it's actually covered with a thicker layer that's called adventitia. This thick layer, it prevents leakage into the thoracic cavity, which contains things like heart and your lungs, right? Like you don't want that stuff on your heart and your lungs. That's not even digested yet. The esophagus is a good example for the histology of the 4 layers of the digestive tract. The diaphragm has a hole in it that is called the esophageal hiatus. And that's where the esophagus punches through the diaphragm and connects with the stomach. That's also the area of the lower esophageal sphincter, also known as the cardiac sphincter. Hiatal hernias, they result from a piece of the stomach kind of poking through this hole right here. I knew a woman once who had a hiatal hernia and she had thoracic cavity surgery, and it was a very rough surgery. So hiatal hernias, small ones, can be dealt with through exercise force. It's kind of where you raise your arms and kind of force the piece of your stomach back through that hole. The diaphragm separates the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Both the trachea and the esophagus have their own adventitia. This white stripe right here, separating these two open spaces on this histological slide, is the adventitia that separates your trachea from your esophagus. So here's the trachea up here. This is the esophagus down here. Of course, getting air in your esophagus will probably just make you burp, but getting food in your trachea is definitely not a good thing. This is why between these two organs, and between the esophagus and other organs in the thoracic cavity, like the heart and the lungs, the esophagus is covered with this thickened adventitia. You don't want what's in there to get into other places. The red layer surrounding the esophagus that looks like meat and the two layers of muscularis externa. Of course, the submucosa is unidentifiable because it's always confusing. And the mucosa of stratified squamous is represented by these purple stripes right here that line the esophagus. The muscularis externa of the esophagus has 2 layers of smooth muscle, and the muscle fibers are oriented in different directions. The muscularis externa of the esophagus also transitions from skeletal voluntary muscle in the superior portion down to smooth involuntary muscle inferior near the stomach. These 2 muscle layers are common to all of our digestive organs. However, the muscularis externa can be modified to suit the purposes of the specific organ. Here, in the esophagus, although gravity helps your food, it is propelled toward the stomach by a process called peristalsis. Peristalsis is alternating contractions of the muscularis externa that propel your food ball, or your bolus, toward the stomach. The circular layer of the muscularis externa contracts, pushing the bolus forward, and then the longitudinal layer of the muscularis externa contracts to shorten the tube further, pushing the bolus forward. These alternating contractions, they continue in cycles in order to move your food bolus toward the lower esophageal sphincter that separates the esophagus from the stomach. Peristalsis is used by all of our digestive organs to keep your food moving smoothly. There are times at which your digestive system will experience a very strong and prolonged contraction of peristalsis throughout the entire digestive system, and this is one way in which your nervous system ensures motility in your digestive system. The submucosa is the layer that doesn't get a lot of play. It just doesn't get a lot of words. It isn't recognized by many. And that's because people do have a hard time recognizing where it is or what it is. Recall that epithelial tissue usually soaks up a dark purple stain, much like the cutaneous membrane. In this picture of the stratified squamous cells of the esophagus, you can see the dead layer of cells lining the lumen and the live layer of cells that separate them from the mucosa. The live layer of cells that separate them from the submucosa. Submucosa throughout the digestive system is usually a mix of areolar and dense connective tissues, maybe even adipose in the large intestine. These large purple ovals here are collections of submucosal glands, and these secrete a bicarbonate-rich solution. Bicarb counteracts some of the acidity that's created by the chemical digestion with your saliva. Bicarbonate in the esophagus is also quite mucousy, not watered down, and therefore it aids in lubrication of the bolus. I have a diagram here of a bicarbonate gland. This also kind of looks like a sweat gland. Maybe I just amended the picture a little bit. As you can see, the lumen of the gland is lined with simple cuboidal cells, and the gland opens and extends through the mucosa and then empties out onto the lumen. So we've got bicarbonate-rich solution forming here, and then it is basically coming out onto the lumen. Peeking out at the right side of this picture, you can also see that characteristic look of steak that is common to our muscularis externa. The mucosa of the esophagus is this purple line surrounding the lumen. The mucosa is stratified squamous, much like the mouth and the throat. In the superior region of the esophagus, there are patches of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and those patches are sprinkled among non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Hopefully this picture here reminds you of skin, with the dead cells closer to the open space or the lumen. Here's my lumen. And the live cells taking up that darker stain and separating the mucosa from the submucosa. Those live cells also look a little bit more plump in their appearance. These big red areas that you see here, people usually ask me about these, those are arteries and veins, showing you that the submucosa is highly vascularized.